you can't fill from an empty cup. Make sure that you are putting your oxygen mask on first, not to over metaphor this, but literally take care of yourself, drink water, go for a walk, come back fresh, unplug a little bit, put your phone down. There's a lot going on in the world, and I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. And that includes at our work, especially with change it's just imminent. And so make sure you're taking care of yourself in whatever way that you need to.
Welcome to the People Powered Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things workplace culture. Let's help you reinfuse your workplace with that happiness factor, a show that gives you the expert insight to attract and keep happy, high-performing employees. I'm your host, Lorianne Duguay, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today. A bit of a pivot here, folks. Rather than bring in companies and continuing our secret sauce series, our culture secret sauce series, I want to pivot a bit and bring in some people who will have some really valuable insight in terms of where organizations might want to start prioritizing their resources, their focus and energy when it comes to culture transformation, to leadership development. Today, we welcome someone who I met years ago when I was doing my Everything DISC certification. You've heard me, listeners, on more than one occasion reference Everything DISC and how we use these powerful tools with our clients to help improve self-awareness, as well as just help people better collaborate. So when I went and did my certification to get my license as a partner, I met this incredible being, this person who was like sunshine in a room, and we immediately connected. And that evening we ended up having drinks and just really kind of sharing our stories and realizing how much synergy we had in general. I have been blessed to be able to continue to connect with her throughout the past several years. And today we are honored to have her as a guest to come and share some of her insights. So thank you, Kati Ryan, for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you in this space again, and I am honored to be here.
Amazing. Before we dive right in, how about we share with the audience a bit more how Kati got to doing what Kati does today, and a bit more about your company as well.
Oh my gosh, how long do we have? Just kidding.
You can take the time you need.
Yeah, so I'm Kati. I'm the founder of a company called A Positive Adventure, and we work primarily with high growth startups and organizing the chaos of learning and development. That includes learning strategy, people workshops, and people coaching. And so love what I do. And it kind of found me. I think that happens a lot in learning and development, and folks I talk to, you stumble into it in a very interesting way. And my story is that I stumbled into learning and development when I was a salesperson. So I worked for a company and I was a high performing seller, and I would stop selling after I hit my goal, and I would go help everyone else on the team hit their goal. And I realized that those were the days that I was most enthused, most energized, and motivated at work. And the company made a role for me, and I became a traveling trainer going in the field with sales reps. And then over the course of many years, became a classroom trainer, virtual trainer, in person, the whole 9 yards. I've pivoted many different industries in my career internally as a head of L&D. And then 7 years ago, I laid myself off in a corporate riff, which was very scary, but I did it. And I launched A Positive Adventure. We are actually 7 years old next week. So really happy to be here. Yeah.
It's crazy because I'm pretty sure you were recently launched when we met. Because if I were to look up my partner license with Everything DISC with Wiley, I would say it's about that old. I'm trying to think of the actual date. Do you recall the year that we went?
I don't remember the actual date, but I know that I went to that training within a year of starting. So it was new.
Oh, yeah. That's amazing. You were right in those inception months.
I was figuring it out, and I'm still figuring it out, but I figured out a few things along the way.
And I think that's what entrepreneurship is all about. Ultimately, it's about continuously figuring it out and having to pivot in that moment, adapt, and your focus is going to be here for now, but knowing that the focus might very well be completely elsewhere within a 1 year period. And that's okay. That's how we grow, we evolve, and we develop as business people, right?
Oh, I couldn't agree more with that. And, you know, you and I connected on that a lot when we met and did the authorization certification together. I think, something that you just shared that spun a thought in me was how, yes, as entrepreneurs, we navigate that. And I think we naturally feel motivated more often than not by change. We see change as an opportunity and we lean into it. And I think there's so much that we can offer about leading by example in how we embrace change and how we can bring that into organizations. Think about the pandemic and how that's shifted so many companies, and people in our lives are so different now. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs that I know felt empowered, impacted, and empowered to roll through that change because they are used to pivoting and rolling through change and that type of thing. And I found, and even in my work and talking to other entrepreneurs, being able to lead by example for some folks internally, client side, people teams that had so much unexpected change coming at them. What do we do? Oh my gosh, this was not planned for, and being able to help them kind of navigate that.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that the way you just described it, I think really defines the entrepreneurial spirit right there, but also is a great segue for us to start talking about different personalities on a team and how, when it comes to being that change leader, there are personalities within the scope of DISC. When we talk about our DIs, SCs, there are personalities that are a lot more averse to change. They don't challenge it. They don't try and resist it because they want to be, troublemakers, or they want to stagnate the team, or really kind of make the progress come to a halt. But rather, they're really sent off kilter by change. They are worried for different reasons. When I'm doing our DISC training, we always talk about how on the lower quadrants of that circular model, the lower quadrant are those who are more resistant to change, but typically for different reasons. While our C's are more concerned by their biggest fear and driven by their biggest fear of failure. And they think that failure can and should be avoided with proper planning. So for them, change, they want to make sure that they're planning it correctly, and they've got time to really digest and make a plan B, C, D, and E, whether they even need it, before they even take action. On the other side of that lower quadrant, we're talking about our S styles, or steadiness, who typically are more concerned on the impact the change is going to have on the people factor, right? Because they are very, very people driven and people centric. So they want to make sure that before they hop on board of any change, that everyone's had a chance to voice their opinion, to voice their. So when we are encountering, to your point of being that change champion, if you will, and modeling the behavior we seek in our team members, also being aware and cognizant that not everybody is going to get on board with change as easily, but it's not because they want to just kind of go against the grain. Taking the time to understand their preferences and their needs when it comes to navigating change journeys, it's super key to ensuring that you're able to equip them as a leader with the tools, resources they need to successfully get through that change, right?
I couldn't have said that better. It's so true. And I think, when we talk about DISC, we always talk about how it's not a measure of skill and ability, right? Oh. It's a measure of preference and tendency. And a lot of times we see it through harnessing productive conflict and even the workplace profile and other ones we use within DISC. We see that when things are tense, we naturally kind of sit in a certain place, and our preferences and tendencies just are what they are, right? Not good or bad. They just are. And it's good for us to know that and understand that. And in a nod to the fact that we're all a blend of all four styles, of course, right? And so I can stretch over into this quadrant. You could stretch over into this quadrant. But a lot of times when things feel tense or sticky, and sometimes that shows up in change, it's good to just acknowledge that we all have different preferences or tendencies, especially in those moments where we might feel a little rattled.
Absolutely. The more rattled, the more depleted we're feeling, the more we're going to gravitate to what we're wired for and what our personal preferences and needs are, right? And to your point of we're a blend of all four, but we also need a blend of all four on a great high performing team. So understanding the value of that. And when we reframe certain behaviors that maybe are a bit of a trigger for us, or they get us from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. For me personally, it's being asked a ton of questions in a meeting when I'm trying to present something and getting a ton of questions. When I was able to reframe that as maybe it's in my delivery, it's not speaking to the needs of each of the different styles that are likely in the room. And maybe because in my true style where I come in, I'm a high ID. And I think Katie and I, one of the things that had kind of had her stand out when we did our training, they had that beautiful circular model, and they had pre-prepped of, I think we were about 40, 50 people in there. And they had put our dots with our initials on that big kind of printout that they'd made. And Katie and I were literally on top of each other or side by, like almost one on top of another, because we are very, very similar in style. But understanding the different styles at play. And when you come into a meeting and when you're able to reframe certain behaviors as, what if it's in my delivery? What if maybe I need to adapt just slight pivot to our earlier point in the way that I'm providing information to make sure that it is cognizant of the different styles that are likely showing up in this room. When I was able to reframe that rather than that person is questioning my competency, which is where I went in my head initially, wow, that game changer right there, right? To be able to understand that. Before we dive a bit too deep into our stories here, let's just quickly highlight what the 4 styles are and how the model works. Did you want to, I know that you're just as knowledgeable as I am with it. So Katie, I'll let you take the floor with that one.
Oh my gosh. Okay, let's see. This is a nice little test. So we have, I think it's important that we reference people as having a style, not being a blank. So you are not a D or an I, you are you. And so it's important that we say somebody has a D style or an I style. So anyways, I'll get off my soapbox about that. But we have D style, I style, S, and C. D styles stands for dominance, I style for influence, S for steadiness, and C for conscientiousness. Once again, you're a blend of all 4 styles, but in all great things, it's a quadrant, it's a wheel, and we talk about pace on the y-axis, and we talk about focus on the x-axis. So our D and C styles on the left side of the wheel are a bit more task focused, and our I and S style on the right side of the x-axis have a bit more people focus. And if we go to the top of the wheel, we've got the D style and the I style, who are a bit more fast paced. And towards the bottom of the y-axis, we have our C style and our S style that are a bit more moderately paced. And once again, it doesn't mean you can't move fast if you're moderately paced. Doesn't mean you can't slow down if you tend to be more fast paced, but it's just a typical preference and tendency. And it's not good or bad. It just is.
Exactly. Absolutely. And it just helps you understand that most people will gravitate towards a certain style, and that's okay. There's no right or wrong style. Absolutely. It's really about understanding and recognizing where you might have opportunity for stretch. Those stretch opportunities are in the moments where, for example, getting questioned a lot in a meeting, if I'm able to understand that, well, maybe it's because I don't take enough time to present information in a logical way, which is why the people who are wired or their preference and needs are really to have things presented to them in a more linear fashion or more logical, sequential type way. If I'm coming in helter-skelter in my true style, then that's definitely going to be a bit unnerving to them. So if I'm then able to take this newfound knowledge and stretch a bit more and take maybe 3 minutes to organize my information on how I'm going to put it out, or even to give a bit of an intro to say, okay, so I'm going to sound like I'm bumping a little all over here, folks, but I'm going to start here, share a few stories here, and just give them a bit of an outline of where you want to go with your point. Right there, you're going to be satisfying and speaking to that particular individual's preference, and they're going to be that much more tuned in and present in what you're saying, rather than trying to figure out, where there's maybe gaps that is hindering them from really understanding the message behind whatever you're sharing, right? So starting to reframe that and understanding that, and then yourself identifying some of those stretch opportunities is really where that beautiful evolution can start to happen.
It's so true. And It's like when we talk to anybody about influencing, I think there's two things that happen when we do what you just described, which is kind of reflecting on where our strengths and opportunities for growth are in presenting or sharing or partnering, collaborating, whatever it is. And the first thing is we become stronger. Our presentations become stronger. Our thoughts become more well-rounded when we think about all four styles. If you design a presentation, if you design a thought leadership piece and you hit all four of what the four styles care about, it's going to be solid.
It's going to be absolutely.
Yeah. And so there's first, selfishly, it's good for you. But then what it also does is it speaks to the person in the way they are able to hear you. So if it's somebody in the room, they're waiting for their slide or their bullet point so that thought that they're thinking over and over, what about this? What about this? They haven't thought about this. When they hear you proactively name that, they can pay attention again. And so I think that's twofold. It's like allowing people to receive information in a way that they're able to, kind of as an interpreter of sorts. Yeah. And then also your point gets heard. And so it's such a beautiful way to think about presenting information and collaborating in groups or even one-on-one.
Absolutely. 100%. And to your point of almost the selfishness, I don't even see it as selfishness. I see it rather as just being strategic and being inclusive of all the different styles at the table and making sure that you're projecting and transmitting information in a way that speaks to all the different preferences and needs out there. Definitely. So you and I was a ID style. I can more or less flip on both because I like fast paced. I like results. I have big ideas. From a stretch opportunity perspective, I've had to train myself to not move too fast because I tend to just go, fail forward, adapt on the fly, go, fail forward, adapt on the fly. But depending on the level of risk involved, listeners, you can understand that might not be the best strategy depending on that high risk situation where I have a lot to lose. What are some of maybe the stretch opportunities that you've noticed in your own personality over time?
Yeah, so I have a DI style. And over the years, I've gone from ID to DI, which we see, right? Like people will move sometimes to the neighboring quadrant. Usually, I've never seen someone pole vault across to an opposite one, but I guess crazier things could happen. But it's not uncommon for us to move around the wheel based on our life, you have kids, you start a company, like whatever it is, you might move because, DISC is a measure of behavior, not personality. Absolutely. And so you can shift your behavior and that's what's cool about it. So I just say all of that to say that I've moved just a little bit. I think the biggest thing for me has been pace, probably because naturally I straddle the people task a little bit more naturally. I think there's two things. One is pace, and I've seen that show up when I'm working with folks who are a bit more moderately paced. DISC has it brought a lot of awareness to me about pace that I hadn't seen before, and how I might not be making the best decisions when I'm moving that fast. When I'm working with somebody else that's a bit more moderately paced, how can that be seen as complementary and not contradictory? And I think that's a key piece, is silence for folks who are a bit more fast paced can feel really excruciating, right? I always say embrace the pause in the DISC training. And then I wait like 3 seconds and don't say anything. And I watch, the Zoom room of who's shifting in their seat. And oh my gosh. So I think it's really important to embrace the pause and be thoughtful about the questions we're asking and how to envelope in those who might not be as outspoken and ready for idea generation on the fly. And I've learned that the hard way in my career, and I've seen it work so beautifully when I take a minute and wait. And an example of that showing up was I was working with someone on another team and is a VP level. We were vetting training vendor for them to work for a very specialized technical training that they needed. So I scheduled the meeting. I had a whole agenda. This guy was there. We'll call him Joe. he was there and he asked a couple questions. At the end, I'm like, okay, let's move forward. I'm ready to send the agreement. And I waited a second and I said, Joe, do you have anything else that you want to ask that maybe you haven't asked yet? And he sat there in what felt like 13 hours, but was probably more like a minute and a half. And he asked a question of this vendor that made us not work with them.
Wow.
And I'm just so grateful. This was after disc training. And I was just so grateful for that, because I don't know how many people historically I have bulldozed through a meeting and gotten to the action steps because I'm trying to get progress, things off, and we made a better business decision because I slowed down. Yeah. And I think that's a really, really big one. There's one more, and it's about the task people focus, because when I'm moving really, really fast, I have a bit more of a preference for task. And so what I have learned over the years is that write the email or the Slack message or whatever it is of what I want, and then go back and add in the niceties and the things I take care of.
Yes. You have 100%. That's exactly what I always do as well. And at first I felt really guilty about it, because I would launch right into, I'd even skip over the hi, Katie. I'm going straight to just checking in. Where's this at? What are we doing with this? What's the next steps? And bulldozing that way, to use your language. And at first, when I had to come back, it almost felt inauthentic, but I really wanted to know how they're doing. It's not because I didn't want to, it's just my brain launched right into the actions and trying to gauge that progress as opposed to checking in on the person. So to your point of coming back, I do that all the time. I even did, I think at one point, a TikTok about it, how when I write a message, I launch right in and then I come back, and I did a screen share where I was retyping the civilities.
Yeah.
The other point I would love to touch on is the silence doing the heavy lifting. And for those who, as she was speaking, I literally have a Post-it that says talk less, because I tend to want to fill those silent moments. I tend to want to fill them with clarifying questions maybe, or reframing and rephrasing the way that I've said something. But there is so much power in that silence, and beautiful aha moments can come about when you just let that silence do the heavy lifting. But you're 100% accurate that I feel the same, that what feels like 13 hours is often just 30 seconds.
Yeah.
It's and you're this eternal, and it's excruciating. So certainly, but again, as someone who is of ID style, and depending on some of them, I'm literally on the line between the two, right at the very outer edge. So I think it's just our tendency to struggle with balancing those two kind of focus areas at the end of the day, that task versus the people part, because I love both. I know that the people part energizes me. I literally called my company People Powered, because that's what fills my cup, right? But as we're getting more and more independent, when we met, I was still working for government. I was still in my corporate career. And I remember you saying, what are you waiting for? Why don't you do this job? Again, I was actually struggling with that risk, and I ended up doing it not too long after, I would say about a year after, and no regrets, but that's where I've had to become a lot more task oriented, a lot more self-driven, self-motivated, right? Which is more towards that more dominant, to your language again, bulldoze approach. Sometimes it might be perceived as a bulldoze approach, but I love that share of your story of in that silence. Someone asked a question that saved you from a really bad corporate decision.
Thanks, Joe. And thanks, DISC trainer. This is when I went through DISC as a learner. And that alone is why I decided to become an authorized partner of everything DISC. I was like, this is so invaluable. And it's so easy to remember. Where you sit, if you understand the X and Y axes, it's just so nice. It's I am being a bit too fast paced right now. I need to dial it back a second. And it just allows me it increases personally me, and I've seen it increase for a lot of other people. It increases your EQ significantly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What are some of the comments that you've heard when you're doing a training? I always find it so funny as they're reading their DISC story, which essentially gives you kind of a little bit more deep dive into what kind of needs and preferences that you tend to gravitate to. And I've heard it was a construction company, and these aren't necessarily individuals who go through these types of exercises and training. They're more familiar with the health and safety type training. So they brought us in, and we were doing that training. And I remember one of the individuals, I laughed so hard. He was like, but seriously, someone's been following me, because there's stuff in here that I've never told anyone, but it's happening in my head. And those thoughts are coming to me when certain things happen that frustrate or drain me, but I never say anything. Why is it in here? Someone's been following me. It's so funny. They're convinced.
Yeah, I've heard that too. I do, like in a virtual one, I'll do a show of hands. I'm like, all right, who read this and thought this is a little creepy? Feels like Big Brother's watching me. And there's so many people that raise their hands. I'm like, okay, anybody like kinda, but maybe you cross some stuff off, and then you'll have a couple. And then I'm like, anybody who is just fundamentally, this does not sound like me at all. And I would say in like 6.5 years of doing this, I've only had maybe 2 or 3 people ever raise their hand there. And afterwards, I stay back and talk to them. And it's usually they were in a mood when they took, like they just got out of a meeting and they were angry, or something's going on at home. So they took it with maybe a different hat on that day.
Absolutely. Or they took it very, very narrowly. They didn't think about themselves across a variety of situations, as opposed to just they thought about, in this particular situation, how did I react to your point in that moment, right? Rather than throughout a variety. What do I tend to how do I tend to react to these kind of things, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we try to do a really good job preemptively when we send out the links, and even before maybe some communication we send about what DISC is, to make it feel psychologically safe to answer it truthfully. Mm-hmm. And a couple of those people who have maybe not felt like their report landed were nervous taking it too. Like, yeah. I think maybe my job wants me to be more like this. And so they were battling themselves through that. And so I think there's a lot we can do as facilitators, partnering with people teams, to make sure we create that space prior to, but it's been pretty rare. Yeah. I've had one person be like, I've literally did not cross off a single thing I had highlighted this entire page for. Yeah.
I too. Well, I always love to share for those where they're putting question marks. I explain that if there's a question mark, it's okay. And it's okay to think that I don't think I'm like this, or I'm kind of on the fence about that statement. But then I always challenge them to bounce it off their partner, their peers, their friends. Because in my case, the first time I ever did DISC, I did the management version. And I remember there was like 3 statements that I was not really sure. And I share the story of they might be indicative of a blind spot, that you're operating with a blind spot that you're unaware of, right? And we can only be, as a driver, you need to be aware of the blind spots in your vehicle to minimize their impact on your day-to-day, right? So I use that same analogy. As a person, you might be operating with a blind spot. And in my case, I was 100% operating with a blind spot, because I first asked my partner and I said to him, I did this thing and it says that I'm like this type, like I tend to be like this. And he's like, yeah, I don't understand your question. I'm like, but am I? I don't really think I am. And he gave me 3 examples from the last week that validated that, yeah, you're right. I guess I hadn't thought about it like that. So then I thought he was biased. So I was like, oh, he's biased because, we spend way too much time together. So I'm just going to bounce it off my peers at work. And I bounced it off them. And they gave me 3 examples from the past 48 hours. So I was like, wow, I've clearly been operating with a blind spot here. So again, regardless of whatever tool you're doing, or whatever type of exercise to increase self-awareness, to increase EQ, take the time to identify those things that might not resonate as much, and challenge yourself to just kind of vet it through a few people to see whether or not this actually might be a blind spot and a stretch opportunity ultimately, right?
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I love that idea. I'm going to borrow that. I think that's really cool for the blind spot awareness. And wow, everybody brought the data for you. You're probably like, yeah. I don't know if you've seen this, but I've had this come up in a couple workshops where I've had a few women come up to me afterwards and feel a little bit nervous about their D style and how they have been called bossy, how the guys in the workshop are proud of their D style, and the women in the workshop have felt a little bit more trepidation about sharing that they have a D style. And there's all kinds of like societal implications for that. And that's not even referencing the intersectionality of a woman of color or anything like that. But I don't know if you've come across that at all, seen that or experienced that, and or how you've navigated that in the classroom.
I have come across it. And what I've actually done is created an opportunity for conversation. All the styles, again, as we're learning to appreciate the different styles on a team, understanding where they bring value and why other people have appreciated that particular style. The other thing that I've also done is created these empathy building exercises where I conduct some team building stuff where they have to literally adopt their polar opposite. And not everybody's comfortable with role playing. Yeah, I get that. But it's funny how that style that tends to take a lot more focus and energy to adapt to because they're literally your polar opposite. People tend to really get comfortable in exaggerating some of the different approaches to the different attributes of a particular style when they're doing this exercise. And then when we revert back to the debrief afterwards, I find there's a lot of opportunities for some rich conversation in terms of how everybody felt within that exercise and how they might have done things differently, and how it was a bit of an aha moment for themselves in terms of how they might be landing with other people. So certainly I've done that as well, but I think it's really important to just use it as an opportunity for conversation, to reemphasize that we need all four styles and to help us appreciate the different styles. And I mean, I love someone who is able to help us drive forward, to help us move forward as a team, to help us start to get some of those quick wins out the door. That's 100%, something that our D style brings to the table. So that's definitely something that we want to emphasize. How have you navigated those kind of conversations?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've had it happen only a handful of times, and I don't know if it's happened in the background and maybe they haven't brought it up to me. But, we create a really safe space in the classroom and make it that all styles are valuable and it's not you versus me and all this stuff. And it's been mostly in private after that. They've come to me and said, hey, this is just something that I was curious about. I have a D style and I'm nervous about this as a woman. I feel like I get called bossy sometimes, and I don't think that happens to my male counterparts as much. And, because I also have a D style, I feel like in that moment I can relate to them. And I even give the example in that moment of the email. Like I go to send an email and then I have to wrap it with what I actually care about because I'm trying to get stuff done. And I don't always see my male counterparts doing that same thing. They just send the email. But I think there is a balance and a superpower in recognizing and doing that.
Yeah.
And so it's just like creating a safe space for dialogue. Usually one-on-one is when this happens. In the classroom, it's always really safe. And I try not to pit them. If ever they're using verbiage like, well, D styles are always this or D's are always this. I'm like, I'm going to stop you, and like reframe the classroom and put a halt to any of that potentially toxic pigeonholing behavior, like always or never language. Like we're not doing
no, exactly.
So yeah, it's just interesting. And I think it's important. I think the first thing I always do is just acknowledge their experience. Like, yeah, that makes sense. That's super valid. And then talk to them a little bit more about it. Like what resonated, what feels tricky about it, and create some type of momentum from the conversation.
So generally coaching them through kind of what might be happening here, what might be at play, and then where they want to go. Yeah, absolutely. But they normally will voice it in the session itself. They'll say like, my God, they make me feel like I must be coming off as, this pushy person at work and it makes me uncomfortable. They're really honest but again, and I'm saying where I've heard it a lot is in the social services sphere where there's high levels of psychological safety, I find, within those teams in general. So they're very comfortable voicing that kind of perspective and saying that this is how it's landing with me. And using that that conversation starter, like I mentioned. I don't know if you do this, but when they present a day in the life of, which is my favorite activity, where they get to really kind of band together and provide this kind of build this tool of, this is how we tend to roll. And this is how, what really jazzes us up. And here's how we can work better together. But we also then give opportunity to the room to say, any questions? Is there anything that you want to better understand about, maybe a certain thing that you've seen, and help you understand how to work better with that individual? And I always get questions for all 4 groups, and it's beautiful because it's like, okay, well, sometimes I feel like when I approach you that you're really crazy busy. What might a better approach look like? What would, if you could have that ideal approach, right? And being able to facilitate on the fly, reframing some of the way people present that question so that they're able to really provide that powerful information and insight to ultimately work better together and to better understand all the styles.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I love that day in the life of activity. There's so many light bulbs that go off, even as they look at how they organized what they were going to do.
Oh my God, that is my favorite. Even just to talk about how they approach the task and how they present. Oh, I love it. But we ended up spending 35 minutes talking about DISC, which is not a bad thing, folks. I've referenced it so often that I'm more than happy to be able to share a bit more information. We didn't even get into this beautiful pivot that Everything DISC, the Wiley company, took during the pandemic and built this powerful platform where we can continue to leverage the insights we gain. We never strive for, I've done DISC. I want to strive for, we use DISC. I try to help organizations really embrace and leverage this powerful tool within their companies to increase collaboration, communication. And so the Catalyst platform is an actual platform where they have access to compare with their peers, to better understand and get insight into that tension that I feel has been building, really get insight into what might be at play. And maybe I called out this person and they're a more private person generally, and I called them out in a public sphere at a meeting or whatnot. Oh, that might be at play. So just to continue to have a bit more insight into what is making our colleagues tick. But I want to make sure that we give you the opportunity to talk a bit more about some of the offerings that your company and the ways that you support organizations. And I know that you delve a lot into leadership as well. So hoping that we're able to at least touch on 1 or 2 challenges that you've been hearing about from your leaders that you've been working with.
Sure. Yeah, let's see. So what do we do over at APA, as we call it for short? We do a ton of leadership development that includes emerging leaders, current leaders, all the way up to strategic level leaders in the business. And we do a lot of workshop program initiatives around that, as well as one-to-one coaching. So everybody at APA is a Berkeley executive coach. We've all gone through that program, and we weave that in a lot to what we do. And that one-on-one integration after a workshop or a program, an initiative, like how do we weave that in throughout, is so fun and beautiful. So we offer that to individual contributors all the way up through the whole company. And then we do a lot of learning and development consultation as well, where we come in and work on a learning strategy for a business. Like, what do you need? And let's help you get the tools in place, tools, products, systems, all those things in place to thrive as an organization. We love that work. And then a lot of times that will include specific initiatives that branch off from that. For example, we do a lot with our high growth startup clients, a lot of new hire training development. Like you've just hired, your headcount's doubling in the next year. What are you going to do with all these new people that come in? And so we help a lot with learning design around new hires. So cohorts, as well as some self-paced stuff there. And absolutely love all of that work that we get to do with our clients. And then specifically what you asked is like, what are some challenges that we've been seeing? And I think I'm seeing probably 3 main things. The first one is a lot of companies right now are coming to us and asking for a specific training on one specific topic. And they're very in the weeds and very excited about that. And what I will always do with them is I will always try to zoom out just a touch why? Like why this topic? Why now? How does this fit into your overall company culture?
Yeah.
Like what qualitative, quantitative data do you have that tells you that this is what you need? And how will this be enveloped into the company? Kind of like you were saying, like we haven't done DISC, we use DISC. I think about that as it relates to every training we ever do. Like not that you've done this training, like how are you going to use this training? Because what we do after training is more important than what we do during training. Absolutely. And the forgetting curve is real. So how do we weave this into the company's learning strategy, the goals, the culture? Is training really what's needed?
Yes.
And it's like, how do we know training is going to help this? Like by the end of this, how will you know it's worked? That's something I love to ask people. Yeah. Like, how will you walk away and say, yep, this was it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you say? Sorry.
That was successful. Yeah, no, exactly. That was a great investment. We've actually improved and leveled up because of that training. Absolutely.
Exactly. And how are we going to measure it? The big L&D question. And I think the big key here is we have to work on the program before we work in it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I have a training that is off the shelf that we could do in 2 hours, but that's not going to work. I feel like I'm committing training malpractice when I do that. It's not going to work. You are going to like it. So let's talk about how we integrate this in. Like, what are your core values? How do we weave those in? How can you put this in the new hire experience? How are the managers going to drive this? How is the leadership team going to allude to this at the all hands, right? Like, how does this fit into your current structure? Like, what tools do you have? Do you use Lattice? Okay, how can we weave that in? Let's include a screenshot. Like, it has to be built in to what currently exists.
Absolutely.
And where you want to go, right? And so I think that's a big thing that I hear a lot. And I, as an L&D practitioner, have failed a client before because I have said yes to a workshop that's normally 3 hours and they only had 1 hour. And I was like, it's all they have. We have to figure it out. And I mean, the survey results are still good, right? It's like 85% ranked it as excellent. Comfortability at the start and the comfortability at the end skyrocketed up. And people felt rushed. The feedback was like, I don't feel like I was able to
too much content for so little time. It felt overwhelming. Yeah, I hear that. Absolutely.
3% of the time that we normally do. And we took things out, but the things are built in there with best practices of learning design. And so I will not do that ever again. I don't care.
Or I'll do a supplementary piece. I've actually, I won't do it condensed, just as a standalone. I'll say, okay, but we're going to build an e-learning that everybody needs to complete ahead of time so that at least they've got some foundational knowledge, and then it becomes really more conversation, discussions around whatever concepts we've introduced in that preliminary, more self-led type stuff.
Exactly. Like that right there, right? It's really looking at the overall learning experience and like, how do we make sure that those key concepts land and they're integrated? I love the e-learning piece, like before and after, maybe even.
Absolutely. Yeah. Something to continue integrating and to continue being able to understand these concepts and reinforcing it for sure. Yeah. Okay. So your 3 challenges that you're encountering, to summarize, the first
is that people want to work on a training and like in a training before they look at the overall program. The other 2 I haven't gotten to yet. The next one is companies are yearning, and a lot of leaders are yearning for change, like change management. So much change has happened in the last 4 years. I don't know if you're seeing this with your clients, but we are seeing an exorbitant amount of continuous change, and continuous change creates anxiety in people. Episodic change is like, there's a clear beginning, middle, and end. And now I'm not scared anymore. But this continuous, constant, so many companies did RIFs during the pandemic and after, and are continuing to do layoffs, return to work, hybrid work. How are we working? New leadership, people leaving, and movement. It is a lot. And I'm seeing a lot more than I've seen since I started APA. And so a lot of EQ in change, like how to thrive in change and help your teams thrive throughout change, is something that we're seeing a lot. And the third thing that we're hearing a lot is that people need to learn how to have hard conversations with each other. how to navigate these conversations, how to bring them up, how to do it when you manage somebody, but how to also do it when you're not managing them. This like cross collaborate where we are equals, or you're above me even in the hierarchy, and I need to bring something up, and we need to have like a collaborative problem solving conversation about what to do. And it's us versus the thing, not us versus each other, because people either argue in a toxic way or they avoid it completely, which brews long-term resentment. And so those are the two like topics we're hearing a lot, with the overall learning strategy piece being the need.
I'm also seeing those two change, absolutely, and understanding, because the only constant in the new world of work is change. So they truly, I'm seeing a demand for helping teams navigate, become more resilient, understand that change has become part of the game at this point, and how can we remain resilient and continue to progress despite this ever evolving world, right? On the last point, you were talking about providing the skills to take ownership of those more sensitive conversations, of those heavier conversations. Also licensed dispute resolution practitioner. So when I'm mediating, I use a term where right at the beginning, where I do these shared commitments, because I don't do ground rules. We're adults. We're all here of our own volition, and especially in a mediated environment, they've both agreed that they want to work on whatever might be at play between them. So I literally take into account the way I set up the room. I put them side by side facing a flip chart, because it transmits this notion that we're here to attack the problem, not each other. Where if you're sitting them on each side of the table, there's that oppositional, just by the way you've set up that environment, there's an oppositional feel. So I tell leaders all the time, if you're having issues with two team members and you want them to work on it together, you can either intervene, but as a very preliminary thing, have them sit side by side with a flip chart, have them jot down what actually might be at play here. What are some of the issues that are frustrating us? Why are we here today? What has gotten us, or what has transpired over the past 3 weeks or months that have led to us having this conversation today? But also giving them tools to have those conversations, to understand the importance of actively listening, and listening to understand as opposed to listening to hear and just kind of move on to that reply, right? And understanding these kinds of very fundamental skills, and supporting your teams in developing those fundamental skills so that they can, in fact, take ownership of those conversations.
I love that. I love the same side of the table. That just makes so much sense. Have you found a way to facilitate that same type of camaraderie virtually?
Absolutely. We do it. It's even easier, I find, when it's virtual, because there's a lot less interrupting. Whereas when they're side by side, they'll tend to kind of launch into, and as that facilitator, that mediator, you're trying to be that conduit between the two, right? So it's even easier when we're on a Zoom room, because everybody, or Teams or Google Meets, whatever it may be, they mute themselves until it's their turn to speak. And they have time to take notes, because normally I'll give them each notes and say, we're going to keep this conversation going until we've each had a chance to truly voice everything that might be at play, so that we're in a position to truly turn that page and start a new chapter in our working relationship. So rest assured that if something comes up, you can take notes. You'll be provided the opportunity to give your take or your perspective of that particular situation. So there's no end. It's not you say it now or that's it, forever hold your peace. That's not how it works. So understanding that, and it's how you really kind of set it up, and how you manage those expectations, and making sure that you're very clear on the process, and virtual or in person, as long as you're setting it up, I think there's a way to do it that almost assures success.
Love that. I feel like every time I talk to you, we share so many ideas. Every time I leave a conversation with you, I'm like, what a cool idea. I want to think more about that and how that might work. So I just really value any time I get to chat with you. So thanks for
100% feel the same, which is why, sneak peek, we are going to be looking at collaborating in some way, shape, or form, and doing something where others can get in on this conversation, and others can certainly leave feeling like they've got a few more things in their toolkit that they want to apply moving forward. So thank you, Kati, for joining me. We are at time, and even way over time, which is fine, because I think it was such a rich conversation that folks will continue listening very of their own volition. So thank you. Is there any parting thoughts or one final nugget of wisdom that you would like to offer our audience before we get into how people can connect with you?
You can't fill from an empty cup. make sure that you are putting your oxygen mask on first, not to over metaphor this, but literally take care of yourself, drink water, go for a walk, come back fresh, unplug a little bit, put your phone down, and take care of yourself. There's a lot going on in the world, and I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. And that includes at our work, especially with change it's just imminent. And so make sure you're taking care of yourself in whatever way that you need to. That's it.
Amazing. If people want to continue connecting with you, how can they go about doing that? What's the best ways to connect with you?
Yeah, I think the best way is, well, we have a website, apositiveadventure.com. You can always check that out and reach us that way. But feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. It's Kati without the E, so Katryan on LinkedIn. And if you do add me, just tell me how you heard about me.
Yes, they heard you. My God, I can't speak. They heard you on the People Powered podcast.
Yeah, just let me know. That way I'll accept. I don't accept randos very often.
Amazing. Thank you once again. Always a great conversation when we get to exchange, Kati. To all our listeners, as I say every single episode, we're hoping that today was helpful and that you're able to take one action, one insight that you've gained throughout our conversation and determine what you can do to start applying that in your life and go do that.
Thanks for joining us for yet another enriching conversation. To hear more about today's guest, make sure to check out the links in the description of the episode. Liked what you heard? Make sure to like and share this on all your socials. Want to continue the conversation? Head on over to our social media platforms to keep it going. Ready to find out how your workplace culture measures up? Then make sure to check out our website at www.bepeoplepowered.com. That's www.bepeoplepowered.com to take our free Happiness Factor culture check. And then sign up for our also free People Powered portal to start building your very own culture transformation action plan. Finally, make sure to subscribe to our show to make sure you don't miss another valuable episode.